Welcome to Reach Church. I'm Marshall Fant, the Director of Church Consulting and Strategic Planning for Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. My purpose is to encourage pastors and church leaders as you refocus, renew, and revitalize your churches. We've established this podcast to offer practical tips and suggestions as you equip disciples to make disciples. Fulfilling the command to train others, that is today's topic on GFA Missions Reach Church. This is Marshall Fant. Welcome back to GFA's podcast Reach Church. So glad to have you both listening and watching. So we got a great topic today. One we have covered in other areas on internships, but really never quite this specific. And we have John Lashuay, Pastor Lashuay from Pine Island Bible Church. John, welcome.
Hey, brother.
And John has been on our, at least I think, 2 podcasts. And
yes,
then Pastor,
that's right.
Pastor Dan Boyce, who is his mentor. And Pastor Boyce, welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, so Pastor Boyce, tell everybody where you are and the name of your church, and then we'll launch into what we want to discuss.
Okay, my name's Dan Boyce. I'm the pastor of the Hill Village Bible Church in Hill, New Hampshire, and also church planting pastor for Winnisquam Bible Church. We're kind of in the middle of the state of New Hampshire. It's a region called the Lakes region, just a little bit north of our capital, Concord.
All right, so let me give you the background of this. Of course, John, Pastor Lashuay and I met, years ago, and we developed a friendship. And I always heard about this pastor that mentored John for ministry. So, John, your background was business, right?
Yes, that's correct.
And then you were a member of Pine Island Bible Church?
Yes. Yep. And
the pastor at that time was Pastor Boyce, right, Dan?
Yes, sir.
All right, so 1 Timothy 2:2 puts it this way. It says, very clearly, in the things which have been, that we've heard and seen, we are to commit those teachings to faithful men who will be able to teach others also. And that's an imperative in there that we are to commit to teach others. And it's an interesting verse because I think this verse is really lived out in the lives of Dan and John. So Dan mentored John, and that's what we're going to talk through. In fact, 2 different commentators on this verse, they call it the living chain of life. The living chain of life that takes really the present and takes us all the way back to the time of Christ. As this command has been fulfilled by generation after generation. And really, so what we're going to talk about is the relationship between Dan and John, and now Dan is doing that again, and we'll get to that a little bit later. So again, Dan, I want to start with you. So again, Dan, so how many years have you been in the pastorate?
A little more than 25.
All right, so at what point in your ministry did you develop this burden to mentor and train other men for the pastorate?
Almost from the start. When I came to Pine Island in 96, it was a church rescue, and my wife and I were the youngest people. We were in our early 30s, and I knew that we needed some young people right away. And early on in my ministry, I heard Dr. David Cummings at a conference, and Dr. Cummings said, there is no success without successors. And that hit me, as well as the verse we started with, 2 Timothy 2:2. And my background was also one where my pastor mentored me. So kind of from the start of my ministry, I was looking for someone to mentor.
All right, so that's great. So your pastor mentored you, and now you turned around and started mentoring others. And, in the beginning, I may have said 1 Timothy 2:2. It is 2 Timothy 2:2, so I stand corrected if I said 1 Timothy 2:2. All right, so Dan, now, John, let me back up a minute. Now, John, did you come to the church to be mentored by Dan, or were you already a member of Pine Island Bible Church?
I was already a member of Pine Island Bible Church, and it was through that through that, we built Pastor Dan really built that relationship with me. He pursued that.
All right. So Dan, what was it you saw in John that really placed a burden on your heart to invest in him?
I first knew John kind of from afar.
Okay.
There were members in our church that are John's aunt and uncle, sure. And John was away in college. He would come back and visit them. I don't know how much of John's background you know. He was MK, missionary kid to the Philippines. When he came here to college, I believe that was around the time his mom died. His dad went back to the Philippines. And when John would come home, he would come to Pine Island, Warwick area. I got to know him then. And then after college, he came and became a member of the church. So I first got to know him as a member and as a young man.
Sorry. So John, about how old were you at this point?
So I graduated college about 23, I guess. So I was in 2000.
Okay.
So, between 96 and 2000 is where Pastor Dan is talking about knowing me from a distance, just summer, winter breaks. And then after I graduated college, I settled in out here in the Warwick area.
All right. So were you married at this time, John?
No, 2 years later, I got married.
Okay. All right. So as you're looking at this and seeing this, so Dan, as you were pastoring John and you see this, how did you build the relationship with him to discern if he was a 2 Timothy 2:2 type of man? How did you develop that?
First off, it started with prayer and specific prayer for a young man to mentor. Mm-hmm. And I assumed right off the bat that John was the answer to that prayer. Oh. So I developed a friendship, got to know him, challenged him in some teaching areas to teach a teen Sunday school class. And from that, it led to taking control of the youth group. Wow. And, just giving him opportunities to teach. And in doing so, in the beginning, I'm sure that they were already lesson plans that were laid out, working that way, and then begin to develop his own. Okay. So just little by little, developing that way.
And so, all right, so then, John, let's shift to you, to how you responded to this. So again, you were reared on the mission field. Mm-hmm. In the Philippines. So you had seen, if I remember the story right, you just kind of ran around barefooted, right? I mean, this was like a boy's dream of where to live, maybe, right? And so you were educated both, but also you were spiritually mentored by your folks on the mission field?
That's correct, yes.
So you came into this as a fairly mature believer, would you say? Or or how? Or
I would say
23-year-old?
After I graduated college, I really got my heart right after I actually went back and visited my dad over in the Philippines and really recommitted my life to the Lord there.
Okay.
Once I came back, I had a renewed vision to, just really pursue things of Christ. And it was right around that time, the end of 2000, that we really started building that relationship, that mentoring relationship, which just propelled us forward. So I was excited just to be able to spend time with Pastor Dan, taking classes. I didn't know where it was going. I didn't even want to be a pastor, to be honest. But so I really didn't even have that kind of an aspiration from the get-go. It was an opportunity to start teaching Sunday school, working with the youth, and I was all in. So, all
right. So Pastor Dan, from Dan, it went from him teaching Sunday school to run the youth department, but then y'all started meeting, right? You started meeting mm-hmm. on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. So Dan, lead us into that, and then John, I'll ask you. So how did you respond to that? Okay.
Well, as a church, I think we licensed John in around '06, right? And, because I had seen some things in him, and John might not. I think John would have been satisfied being like a second man, but we realized that the hand of God was upon John, so we licensed him, and I had a informal Bible Institute going, that John would take classes in, and that Bible Institute, there were other church members going, trying to fulfill what it talks about in Ephesians, training the people to do the work of the ministry. I didn't want to do the work of the ministry alone, and through that, and through just questions that John would have, and times we would spend together after evening services. I noticed that John was hungry. And so in being hungry, I felt the responsibility to feed him. And so we started meeting together once, sometimes twice a week, early in the morning. 5 o'clock in the morning before work, around my dining room table. And I guess we did that '06 until at least I left. So about 4 years we did that.
Wow. So every week you met at your kitchen table.
Yeah.
5 a.m. All right. So now, Dan, let me follow that up with a question. So you had been mentored, but was John the first one you had mentored in this fashion?
Yes.
Okay, so was there a theology book y'all worked through together? Did you just pick certain doctrines to work through together? So Dan, first as the teacher, the mentor, how did you approach that with materials to mentor John?
Well, in the beginning, we used a book that was called Wilmington's Guide to the Bible.
Okay.
And but then and that was more to kind of see how the Bible was laid out. But when we started getting into theology, we started on the very first page and worked all the way through the book. Dr. Floyd Barrickman's Practical Christian Theology. Floyd Barrickman was a Bible teacher at Practical in upstate New York when it was called Practical. I don't know what it's called now.
Okay.
That was the book that I used in my Bible Institute. It was that I attended. It's what I was familiar with.
Sure.
And so we worked through that book, and then some. When I went to school, some pastoral theology notes that I had, we worked through. And when it got to the point, some hermeneutic and homiletic studies as well when it got to that point.
All right. So John, how were you responding during this? I mean, you're getting up, you're working, you got a job, at some point you start a family, and you're meeting at 5 a.m. So, I mean, I know that was a little bit of a grind, right? I mean, to do this and continue on.
It was, but it really didn't feel like a grind.
Okay.
I was thrilled. I was thrilled to be able to just talk theology and talk church with my pastor. What a blessing that was. It didn't feel like it was a grind at all.
Okay.
It may have felt like a grind for Pastor Dan, 5 a.m., getting up in the morning, but
I was younger then.
Yes, you were. But it really, I don't know, it was a neat process. I believe how God just graciously guided us along and really was kind of moving my heart, working on my desires, and giving me the desire to explore these things further and grow in this way. So it really didn't feel like a grind. It was really a blessing. So,
all right. So Dan, John, when Dan recognized your giftedness and went to the church and that's the church recognizing, which is part of what the local church does. What was your reaction to the church licensing or recognizing you with the giftedness of ministry, and then with the licensing? What was your reaction to that?
It was, if I remember correctly, it was a neat time. It was an encouraging thing to be able to see the more of a formality of it, and kind of take on that more. It made it more serious, and as to the direction God was really kind of really laying out for me and my family with the church. And so there was an encouragement, but it took on a more serious tone to it in a way that was good, that helped me look at it from that perspective that, this isn't just a hobby, if you will, this is the direction God's taken us. So,
and I guess it had to be encouraging to see your pastor and the church coming along beside you.
Oh, absolutely.
And then the time commitment, and really, I think the way a lot of commentators say about 2 Timothy 2:2, we guard the trust that's been given to us. And Pastor Dan, your pastor, was passing this trust. He was teaching you this to carry on to the next generation. All right. So now, how long, Dan? So as you're doing this, how did you mentor John in preaching? Because you already had him teaching.
Right.
So how did you mentor him in preaching?
Well, again, it started with that teaching prepared lessons already and getting comfortable with that, then developing some of his own, and then, assigning him times to preach and working through messages with him and then critiquing him afterward, and, that was part of the process. Sometimes I would have him fill in because I wasn't there, so I would need to listen to recordings and whatnot of them. But and getting feedback from people in the church as well. About people that were. You could ask these kind of questions too, and so getting feedback that way.
How long, Dan, did the process take? Not that John was a slow learner or fast learner. That's not. But this is a process. This is a disciple making process. So, Dan, with John, from the time you gave him teaching responsibilities until the time you felt like, okay, God has prepared this man, and he is now ready to shepherd this flock. About how long was that?
Well, the whole 10 years I knew him, I was leading into that direction.
Okay. All right.
And I think toward the end, one of the reasons why I felt I could leave is because I knew that John was prepared and John was ready. So and probably from the serious side of things, the last 4 years were were serious study and whatnot, and I knew. Of course, all of us, when we go into our first ministry alone, are we really prepared? Yeah. You understand what I'm saying?
Fully understand.
But I felt that he was ready. One of the things that there in Pine Island, one of the things I did not do enough work at was preparing the church for John.
Okay.
That's something that I have worked more in now, not only preparing the man, but preparing the church.
Okay, so let's stop. Hold on a second now, because instead of sending John to another ministry,
right?
John stayed at Pine Island, and you went somewhere else. Is that right?
Right.
So, in a lot of ways, that's a situation you got to work out. So, what was it? And then I'm going to come to John. But Dan, what was it that led you to say, "Okay, I'm going to leave and John's going to stay"? What did the Lord use in your heart to determine that?
A series of events. New England has always been on my heart for the need of a gospel witness.
Okay.
I have been coming to New England most of my life prior to coming here on vacations. We have family up here. My sister and mother and whatnot moved up here. I have family, so there was a desire to reach my family. But even more than that, there was a pastor who was retiring that I knew that lived up here, and he said, "I've been praying, and I think that you and Sandy need to come up and replace. I'm retiring, and we want you." And that hit me out of the blue. I never in my life thought about leaving Pine Island, and from that point on, and putting that little seed, I dropped my son off at Bob Jones University. And we sat through a chapel, and the chapel was about the need in New England.
Wow.
The following year, we dropped our son off at Pensacola, and the chapel message was about the need in New England. Every periodical, it seemed like I picked up, was about the need in New England.
Wow.
And it was just a series of events. And then there was a group of people who called us if we would consider to come up and plant a church, and we came and we planted a church in January of 2010. I do not recommend moving to New England in the winter.
Wow.
So
no, all right. So in case I did not say it, Pine Island is in New York.
Right.
So John, that's what, an hour and a half outside the city. How far are you from? Is that about right? Just
Yes,
I'm trying just
correct.
to place it so people get an understanding.
So it's right over it's right on the New Jersey border into New York.
Right.
We're slightly north of the city, but mostly west.
All right. So now, John, let's switch to you. So what would be, all right, you're the one being mentored, okay, along this process from start to finish, 10 years or thereabout. Of course, Dan was praying all along, so it starts with prayer. And as this process took place, as the one being mentored, okay, and someone's listening to this podcast and they may be having that desire, what are some of the keys of being mentored that you would advise that listener?
When it comes to being mentored, obviously you want to be getting involved in your local church to start off with, and allowing God to be able to lead you into opportunities and be able to step into opportunities, even though they may be outside of your comfort zone, but allow God to really develop that gift in you to see the reality of it.
All right. So when
just
Dan
be willing to be used of God.
So when Dan first asked you to teach, had you taught before?
No.
Okay.
No.
So again, you're willing to step out a little bit there, right?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Keep going. So I think that's the key. You've got to be willing to. If you're being mentored and your mentor asks you to do something, you have to be willing to try it. Okay. What else, John?
You do. And you got to be willing to put the time into it. It is a challenge because it is something that, I mean, to start teaching, I know we started teaching with the teens, and then Pastor Dan ended up giving me, allowing me to teach the adults, which was even more scary, But it was just being willing to be used, and I don't know, just take the time to be intentional in your study. I know the Lord really worked on my heart, helping me to understand the need to be so intentional in my devotional life, and I think that was one of the major keys. It was kind of like this aha moment for me, because in the beginning, but here we go. I know I'm supposed to be doing my devotions, and but I also need to study to teach Sunday school class. So, hey, this is a great thing. I can combine them, and we're off and running, and this is good. And the Lord quickly convicted my heart, saying, "Nope, this is not how that works. You're not going to get killed two birds with one stone." And so that was an amazing. It brought great dividends, I should say, by having such conviction about my devotional life, my personal time with God, that when it did come time for the interim period that I was in, I I believe that by not neglecting my personal devotions, it enabled me, God used that mightily to help me through that 2.5-year interim, which, but my personal devotions was absolutely vital, and it's still, as it should be, right?
Sure.
So, but that was amazing thing that God brought great clarity and conviction about that. So,
all right. So was there a moment of clarification for your wife as you're going through this and you realize that Pastor Dan is now mentoring you for, vocational ministry? Was there, what was her reaction to this?
That was again a neat process of kind of like God just laying out the breadcrumbs and graciously walking us through it. I think how Pastor Dan worked with me, it kind of helped Kara slowly acclimate to what ministry life would look like, and so it helped to bring her into that. And so it was just that stepping stone process. And in the beginning, I don't think it was. We both weren't looking at it as this is going to be a future, as far as like being a pastor and pastor's wife. It wasn't even on the radar at all. And so I think it was just God's gracious way, because Kara has recently, on a number of occasions, one of the things she had made very clear when we got married was, I'm not going to be a missionary's wife. Okay. We're not going to go to the mission field. And she said later on, jokingly, she's like, well, I wish I would have said, put the pastor's wife stipulation in there. But it was just God's gracious way of just guiding us through, which I give him just all praise for that.
All right, so now, John, Pastor Lashuay, you've been at Pine Island Bible Church now as a senior pastor for how long?
So I was voted in 2012. So we've just completed 10 formal years as the senior pastor.
All right, so now, Dan. All right, so now it's my understanding you've started this process again in New Hampshire, correct?
Yes. I've pretty much turned the Hill ministry over to a man named Andrew Hemingway, and he's pretty much pastoring that church. I am taking the responsibilities at the new church plant.
Now, did you mentor him to where he is?
Yes, he did go to Bible school. He's a graduate of Ambassador.
Oh, good.
But never felt called to preach. The minute I came to Hill, I noticed Andrew, and I began to pray for him, that the Lord would allow me to mentor him. And we spent 5 years together with another man that was here at the time, going through theology, and ministry, and preparing Andrew for his ordination. I gave him opportunities to run meetings and deacons meetings, congregation meetings. Gave him opportunities to preach and teach, even to preach series and things like that. And again, I've pretty much turned all the Sunday responsibilities over to Andrew at the church, and I've been doing the church plant.
All right.
I'm currently in the beginning stages of working with 2 young men, one who is a core member of the church plant, and the other one who is a member back at the Hill Church. So we're in the beginning stages.
So this is just what you do. This is your ministry.
Yeah, it really is. Yeah. It's when I came here and we had the Q&A time before they called me as their pastor, I let them know that very first day that if you call me as pastor, I'm going to be training young men for the ministry. And in particular, we have a burden to reach New Hampshire, training men for the ministry here. So they've known that since day one.
All right.
Where I feel that I I didn't do a good job in training the church in Pine Island,
Right.
As well as John. I learned that I needed to train the church better. So they have known from day one that I'm looking for my replacement, you know, and not necessarily that I'm leaving, but, you know, it would be an easy transaction, you know.
Sure.
So.
All right. So I think another way we could put it is, you know, I think Vanderbloemen puts it this way, that every pastor is an interim pastor. So really, we have to have that mindset that we always need to be training the next person. Okay, so let's start to wrap this up. So, John, let me ask you this question. John, what would be your advice to a man that was in your shoes when you started this many years ago about being mentored? So how would you, and by the way, both of their email addresses will be in the show notes, but John, how would you advise this man?
Well, I would say first start off by just being willing to step into ministry opportunities. See the value of spending time with your pastor. I think that's a tremendous thing. It is a blessing. It can be a great blessing to your pastor, but also it's a great blessing to yourself, just in the nature of you're spending time with a man who loves the Lord and just really desiring to pour his life into you. So there's a great value there. And also don't take that time for granted, because he's giving his time is important. So I just think there's place a large value on his time, but be willing to spend time with him in a lot of various ways, but be willing to reach out and ask how you can help. Show your willingness to be used, you know, in any way. All right. Clean the church, whatever, you know, just offer yourself up to be used. And it allows your gifts and your heart to be seen, be on display, that you just might be the answer to your pastor's prayer, that I think just could be pretty special. So
good, thank you. All right, so Dan, it's very obvious in your life all this started with prayer, both for John as well as the minute you went to New Hampshire. And still now, as you're doing another church in New Hampshire, that's the foundation, right? Prayer.
Yep.
And then really a commitment to be. You have to be committed to invest in others' lives. All right. This just came to mind. Let me ask this, Dan. Was 5 a.m. was that like a filter to see if he's really committed, or is that just convenient? I mean, because we have limited time.
Right.
All of us have limited time.
Right.
So, and again, 2 Timothy 2:2, I don't want to invest in somebody that's not worth investing in.
Right.
All right. So, comment on that.
That's part of it, but it was also, you know, practical. It was the time that we both, John was just married and, you know, having little kids. I had, you know, preteens at the time, and, you know, you have your not only church responsibilities and your family responsibilities. So, you know, you just have to sacrifice and find the time where it fit, and it fit for us. John lived very close to the house where I lived, and his work was not far from the church. So 5 a.m. fit. And, you know, I don't do 5 a.m.s anymore. So.
All right. So how long, Dan, with John and with these you're mentoring now, how long was each session, just roughly, time-wise?
I would say hour to 2 hours, you know, depending on the day, you know, and, you know, the sessions here were a little bit different because the two guys I was mentoring, you know, they were on staff, so we were all in the same, you know, offices and whatnot. So we were able to work out different times, and sometimes they were longer than others. And you know, with the three of us being together, there was opportunities for questions and whatnot, throughout the day. So.
All right. So I'm going to give you all a last word. This living chain of truth. I love that phrase about 2 Timothy 2:2. And it was lived out in your life. I know John, we've already talked, he's praying for somebody to mentor. So I love the process. They know, of you doing this. And so, Dan, what last words would you like for our listeners to have?
Well, speaking from the more older guys who are doing the mentoring, just do it. First off, start with prayer. Pray for a man, and then look for a man. Observe your congregation, and then challenge a man. Give him an opportunity to teach. And then train a man. And think of the church as like a laboratory, if you will. Take him on visitation with you to hospitals and visit new people and shut-ins and whatnot, and train him about preaching, and give up your pulpit. Don't be that's part of it. If you're going to train a guy to preach, you have to be willing to give up your pulpit. And one of the things, and I am not against. I want to be very careful in saying this. I'm not against Bible colleges.
Right.
But sometimes we send our brightest away to Bible colleges, and they usually don't come back. A lot of this, what I've done with John and with the guy, it works with older guys who have a family. They don't have to go off to Bible school.
Yeah.
You can work with them. And then one of the other really practical blessings is I just love wrestling and talking theology with these younger guys. We don't often get to do that with our congregation, where we can wrestle with some of these doctrines, the Ordo Salutis of salvation, and we can wrestle with election and regeneration and all these things, and it keeps you sharp. And then shepherding your church leaders. Not everybody is going to be a pastor,
right?
But you could shepherd your leaders, and it helps you with the ministry. It prepares people for the work of the ministry, and on a real practical level, it helps you with pulpit supply.
Yeah,
if you go on vacation, if you are sick or whatever. But training the church to do the work of the ministry.
Amen. So
there's lots of blessings.
And your replacement comes from within versus without. Yeah. I think that's okay. Pastor excuse me. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, I mean, and how long have churches been between pastors and without? That time is growing.
Yes.
So if you look for your replacement within, that can definitely shorten that time.
Amen. So. All right, Pastor Lashuay, last words.
Yeah, Pastor Dan summed it up really well.
He did.
A lot of key practical things that he was talking about. I would really encourage pastors to see the value of this process. I know in ministry we're busy. There's always more to do than what we have time to do. But I think if we're not careful, we don't see, sometimes if we're not careful, we don't put priorities in the right place. This is something that we really need to put a high priority on.
Yeah.
It's mentoring men for leadership, shepherding the hearts of the next pastor, because by God's grace, the next pastor should come from within. But to see the value of spending time with, somebody who he may not be pastor material, but are you willing to put your time in that God might have his hand on him, and it might be through your simple spending time with him that might be developed and be seen, be revealed. And so be intentional in prayer.
Yeah.
But for men who are looking to, who feel like maybe they have a little bit of that gifting, allow it to be developed and spend time with your pastor. There's so much more, but
yep. All right, so I think as believers, right, we're to make disciples. We're to reproduce ourselves as believers, and pastors, we should be doing the same thing.
Absolutely.
We should be reproducing our life in the lives of other men. Okay, Pastor Dan Boyce, Pastor John Lashuay, thank you for your time. Your emails will be in the show notes, so I challenge people to listen and then reach out to you with questions. Man, thank you very much.
Thank you, brother.
Marshall. Thank you. Thank you, John.
You're listening to ReChurch, a podcast of Gospel Fellowship Association Missions. If you would like more information about our ministry or how we may assist you and your church, visit us at gfamissions.org/consulting.